For this virtual stroll, we're exploring Marpole. We're starting our walk underneath the Arthur Lang Bridge on Hudson Street, and we're standing outside the gates of the transit centre. Eburn and Marpole are two names you're going to hear on our walk a lot, and they're the same place. Mr. Eburn opened a store on this side of the river, but then he moved it to Sea Island later on, hence two Eburn communities. 1916, the folks on this side of the river voted to change the name and chose Marpole. My friend Angus McIntyre, who's helped out on a couple of these virtual walks, is also a retired transit driver, and so we have access to the centre, and that's where we'll get underway. We're up here on the deck of the transit centre overlooking the Fraser River. Marpole is actually older than the city of Vancouver. Non-native settlement began here in the 1860s with preemptions along the shoreline for agricultural land, sometimes for Royal Engineers and others for just farmers that saw the value of the land here. However, this is Musqueam land, and just off to the west we can catch a glimpse of part of the Musqueam Reserve, and archaeological evidence puts the Musqueam here on the river at least 8,000 years ago. Musqueam territory runs all the way down to Tsawwassen, encompasses the south arm of the Fraser River into Surrey, all the way up into the North Shore Mountains. And this was a boundary set by the Musqueam Declaration of 1976. And non-native settlement came in here because of that farming, as we mentioned, and it was preemptions. And a preemption, quite simply said, one person could come in, stake out a claim to 160 acres, live on the land for a couple of years, make, quote, improvements, and you got title. Now, Musqueam and other Indigenous people around would have probably liked to have taken advantage of that instead of being stuffed into reserves. A legislative sleight of hand in 1866 took the Indigenous people of Canada and British Columbia out of the preemption process, so they weren't actually allowed to own land. And well, everyone else came in here and grabbed things. In 1889, as they're starting to dig some of the roads and things like that, they actually dig through dirt and they find what's called the Marpole Midden. This is actually a massive archaeological site that stretches for a very long distance along Southwest Marine and down the slope towards the shore of the Fraser River. Often characterized as a garbage dump, this isn't actually garbage. This is 5, 6, 7, 8,000 years of constant occupation on this site. And the Marpole Midden was just sort of seen as, oh yeah, cool, let's dig for bones, let's dig for artifacts. And unfortunately in museums we have artifacts, but they've been removed from the stratum, so we have no idea where they fall on a chronological thing. And then it made good road fill, shells were crushed and used as the base for many of the early roads. And so today, the Musqueam are very protective of this and very proactive. And so they own the Fraser Arms Hotel to primarily prevent it from being redeveloped and destroying the midden underneath it. And constant vigilance is necessary given the most recent controversy over a development site on Southwest Marine Drive. Everyone needs to pay attention to this whole area. We're down here at the foot of Hudson Street, just around 75th, and this is actually where Eburn / Marpole begins. You actually have James Mackey and you have Mr. Carraby, who are the first of the early preemptors out here in the 1860s. And so that initial non-native settlement were farmers. However, with that little bit of activity of farming, there was a Mr. Eburn who thought that this might be a good spot for a store. And we're right on the Fraser River where the boats from Victoria, Vancouver Island and New Westminster would pass by, and so the farmers could flag them down and load the produce, either send it to New West or to Victoria. That little wharf, that then became a really important spot for these early settlers, and Eburn's store then became the center of a growing community. So with the general store for Mr. Eburn and the farmers, and then there was a Methodist church, and so we actually had the basis of a small community. And in the 1912 fire insurance map that's here in my notebook, you can actually see right where we are the Eburn Mill, a huge industrial concern that started in the 1890s and lasted right through until the 1990s, and then businesses. And so this was 4th Street, later to become Bridge Road, which later became Hudson, and of course there was the trestle bridge over to Sea Island, and then the second trestle bridge over to the city of Richmond. And so here The streets, Clinton, Griggs, and Goodmurphy, are named after early settlers. Goodmurphy owned a cannery down here, and you can see the business blocks. And David Suzuki's family owned a dry cleaners here on Hudson Street. And as we flip through my notebook on various Marpole notes and things, I think what's really interesting is here's the hardware store. And this was directly across the street from us, roughly where the taxis are parked on the parking lot there. And so you get a sense that they're really busy and quite large business district down here. And all of that was swept away with the construction of the Arthur Lang Bridge, which gets you to the airport quite easily. But it took out all the traces of early Marpole. Where we see those very large concrete pipes and the silos for gravel and things, this is actually the earliest business down here. This was the site of the Dudney Gravel Company, 1912. And we've had a gravel company, concrete company, ever since on the site, and there's still one very active today. Until very recently, this grouping of rather oddly painted vans was parked here for many years under the bridge. Down here on the Fraser River, there are some vestiges of the old industrial past. Because of low tide, we're down on the rocks, and as the camera pans, we're looking up into a small bay here, which is in fact the old ways for a barge building operation. The sawmill that we talked about, the Eburn, well, they built their own barges to transport lumber to market, and so this slope all the way up to the modern lumber yard behind it is where the rails were set, which would then drop the barge slowly down the slope and then out into the water. And until very recently, the winch house was there as well, the small engine house that drove the winches to pull the barges up and back. And there was a barge here up until very recently, pretty waterlogged and a navigation hazard. The Fraser River was a very busy waterway, and the low-level bridges posed a bit of a navigational challenge. In particular, the road bridge and the BC Electric's rail bridge caused trouble because their swing spans were not lined up. And after clearing the opening of one, the captain had to quickly turn and align with the other one. And if it was foggy or the currents were strong, well, you sometimes hit the bridge. This actually happened so much that the province newspaper's cartoonist had a bit of fun with it, with this illustration. Making sure there's access to the waterfront is an important planning consideration for the city of Vancouver. And so as development happens along the Fraser River, we've seen trails and pathways and new parks being created. So down here on the edge of the river, in front of the transit center, we have a partial trail. It's blocked at one end, but you get sort of these platforms out over the river with some great views. You can do some airplane watching, and you can stroll down to the end where you can find a much patched chain link fence that just stops you from getting over to the next piece of the trail. However, over time, this will be connected. When you're constructing a building, you often have to dig a large hole for its foundations, and the dirt has to go somewhere. It's trucked down here to the Fraser River, where it's dumped onto a barge, which is then towed off Point Grey to a legal dumping ground. And just beyond this operation, we can catch a glimpse of the former log pond, which is now a Musqueam-owned marina and repair operation, as well as the very popular Milltown pub. As we look at the 1912 fire insurance map here, we can see the different rail lines here. We have the spur that runs into the mill, and we have the line that comes down, noted as the Arbutus line today, and then out here the continuance over to New Westminster. And so this then became an incredibly important junction where we had the Marpole station. And so you would take the trains down from downtown Vancouver, you could get off here, you could transfer to the train that went out to New Westminster, or you could carry on to Steveston. The line was initially put down by the Canadian Pacific Railway, thinking that they would have a steam train that went to Steveston, moved all of the canned salmon down to Vancouver, loaded on their ships, and then take it off to market. However, that plan failed because Steveston actually has a really good deep harbor for ocean-going ships. And so by 1905, the BC Electric Company has taken the line over, electrified it, and running trains to Steveston for passengers. It was about a 30-minute service. Every 30 minutes you had a train. And then a few years later, they figured they might as well take over the Canadian Pacific line to New Westminster, and they electrified that. And so they ran passenger service to all the different mills. So you actually had stations called plywood and various things like that that related to the industries. At the northeast corner of Southwest Marine and Hudson, where the condo is today, was the site of the impressive Brower Building. Built in late 1912 at an estimated cost of $60,000, it was operated as the Grand Central Hotel before becoming an annex for the Vancouver General Hospital, and unfortunately was demolished in the 1960s. So we're standing at Hudson and 73rd Avenue, and Hudson Street was the commercial section of Marpole, and the streets were surveyed as a commercial width street, and the stores lined the streets here in these blocks. It was because of the bridge that got you to Sea Island and then eventually over to the city of Richmond. And so the traffic came up Hudson, and that gave the reason to build stores here. And in the early days, Walsh's store served as a meeting place for the congregation that became St. Augustine's Church, the Anglican church just up the street. Also, Walsh's was the site of the first meeting of the Point Grey Improvement Society, which decided that they really wanted to say goodbye to the municipality of South Vancouver and create a new municipality called Point Grey. And so in 1908, they took their leave of South Vancouver and established the municipality, and it started here on Hudson. As well, we had a number of other organizations and churches in the neighborhood, meeting in grocery stores and other small settlement buildings before branching out and building their own facilities. And then Hudson has changed over the years. The construction of the Oak Street Bridge essentially destroyed the commercial activity here because people drove over and above and bypassed Hudson completely. But it provided home for the Scottish Cultural Centre. They used to be in a smaller building over at 16th and Burrard. They've moved down here with their great big hall. We've got a couple of other larger churches down here, a Catholic school, etc. And even the little shopping plaza there recalls that commercial activity. Marpole had a sizable Japanese community, and it was centered around Selkirk Street, which was both a residential and business district, and it's where you'd find the Japanese Hall. This building from 1927 was a language school, a Buddhist temple, a kindergarten, and a community meeting place. The Japanese were involved in boat building. They also worked at the canneries on the Marpole shore and the Sea Island shore, and with their forced removal from the coast during World War II, the Japanese Hall was sold and given to the Boy Scouts of Canada. Moved from its original location at 72nd Avenue, it now sits at 70th and Southwest Marine Drive. And in 1991, the Boy Scouts of Canada erected the plaque on the building to acknowledge the building's history. St. Anthony's Catholic Church has been in the neighborhood since the 1920s and sits at Montcalm and 73rd Avenue. It occupies a striking modernist brick structure which was built in 1954. However, 2 years after it opened, it suffered a devastating fire. But it was rebuilt, and it's interesting to see how many crosses have been incorporated into the seemingly simple facade of this church. In the Marpole Heritage Context Statement, we described one of the character-defining elements of this neighborhood as this apartment district that we're standing in. We're actually at Montcalm and 71st Avenue. We are standing amongst three-story walk-ups, which were all built in the early 1950s right through into the 1960s, the odd 1970s building. What's interesting here, this is an incredible resource. This is affordable, well-maintained rental and very large apartment units as well. But what's really interesting here is that when the City of Vancouver, the municipality of Point Grey, and the municipality of South Vancouver were all looking towards that amalgamation in 1929, each municipality created zoning plans and other plans in preparation, and the municipality of Point Grey set this district from 70th to 72nd originally, all the way from the other side of Granville Street, all the way back to the almost to Cambie Street as an apartment district in 1929. Now it took until the 1940s, the late 40s, to actually build the first of the apartment buildings, and just over on my right is the very earliest building here from about 1947-48. And then in the 1950s, in the big review of zoning in the city, the apartment district was extended all the way down to Southwest Marine Drive. And so that gives the city an incredible resource of, as we said, well-maintained and affordable buildings. But when you look around the city, up at 39th and the Boulevard area in Point Grey, that was set aside in 1929 as an apartment district, as well as the West End and other areas. And so those areas of high density aren't modern inventions. They actually are a very, very early planning initiative from these municipalities. And now a word about balconies. As you walk through a neighborhood like this, you have buildings without balconies, you have buildings with small balconies, and you have buildings with some fairly large and substantial balconies. So, no balconies prior to 1962, small balconies 1962 to 64, and after that, 64 onwards, full-size balconies found on the buildings. So we're standing in front of St. Augustine's Anglican Church, and we're at 71st and Hudson. And this is the church that got a start in Walsh's grocery store back in 1909. Under Reverend Battersby, there was some plans drawn up for the church, and this was actually consecrated in 1911. And it's a delightful shingle-style English country church. You can imagine this being built out of fieldstone, for instance, or possibly brick. It's just a lovely little arts and crafts church. In fact, a newspaper article in 1947 looking at churches in Vancouver actually said that St. Augustine's was, I quote, one of the most beautiful and compact suburban churches in the city. And I thought that was rather lovely. And so it's actually very well kept. And you've got the shingle work and you've got the leaded glass and various other things. The interior is very much intact as well. And a delightful personal note in researching the church for a walking tour a long time ago, I discovered who the contractor was, and they made a note in their construction notes, interior by Cornish and Cooper. And Cooper was in fact my great-grandfather who ran Cornish and Cooper, which was a sash and door factory, first on Seymour Street, then over in False Creek, roughly around where the Olympic Village is today. They outfitted everything from churches, and pews in here are from that firm, as well as the Fernie Courthouse and many other things. But it was a delight to be able to be inside the church and sit in church pews that my great-grandfather's firm produced. At the corner of 70th and Hudson, we find the former Fire Hall number 22, which is actually the former Point Grey Fire Department Hall number 4. It was built and opened in 1922, and it lasted until 1982. It became a seniors drop-in center, and unfortunately flood damage in 2013 closed the building. However, a restoration and a rebuild in 2018, it reopened as Vancouver's newest neighborhood house, serving the local community. At 70th and Cartier, we find the McDonald Block. Built in 1912, it's a wood frame and brick building, and it illustrates how 70th Avenue was supposed to be a major retail street, except the 1913 Depression kind of crushed those dreams, and that has left the building isolated here on the street. Abandoned for many years after the grocery store closed, it was recently reopened as a coffee shop. There are changes afoot in Marpole since the adoption of the Marpole Community Plan, and the for sale sign here is one indication of development interest in the neighborhood. At 70th and Granville, the big change has been the redevelopment of the Safeway store into 2 residential buildings. Safeway's was retained on the site, and in a nod to its heritage, the curved glulam beams that once held up the main store are now used to hold the glass canopies up over the sidewalk. One thing to look out for between 70th and 68th Avenue on Granville Street are the crosswalk designs by Musqueam artist Robin Sparrow. They were installed in 2019. Also at the corner of 70th and Granville, Tad's Sporting Goods. Originally opened on Southwest Marine Drive in 1950, when Kozo Kitagawa and his son Tad returned to Vancouver after being removed during World War II. The store has had a couple of locations on Southwest Marine Drive before landing in its current location. Further up Granville at 67th was the original location of the White Spot restaurant. It opened in 1928 as the White Spot Barbecue, and by 1938 a dining room had been added. That became known as the Granville House. The large white log building was a local landmark until it was destroyed by fire in the 1980s, and the site has since been redeveloped. Just below 17th Avenue on Southwest Marine Drive is the Coburn House. It is the local museum operated by the Marpole Historical Society. It was built in 1912 by Thomas T. Thomas, and the Coburn name comes from Henry Coburn, a Canadian Pacific Railway conductor who bought the house in 1936, and he and the family lived here until 1981. The house was saved from demolition by the Historical Society, and they opened the house as a museum to the community in 2005. And it's a delightful little Dutch gable house, probably a pattern book house, and it now sits right next door to William Mackey Park. And here at the Coburn House is where our walk and look at Marpole ends. However, there's a lot more to see in this neighborhood, and so we'll come back for part 2, where we'll look at some really interesting residential properties, including the historic Kagawa House, Abbeyfield House, and a raft of really interesting vernacular buildings scattered throughout the northern part of this fascinating neighborhood. And before we go, I thought this might be fun. Angus and I were in the transit center and walked through part of their training facility. And hanging from the ceiling were the trolley wires, and Angus took a moment to explain how they work. So here's that short video.
So if you make a turn and it activates, this frog here will go like that.
Right.
And you see how that is now set for the turn? When the shoe goes through, it actually hits this deflector and it sets it for straight ahead again.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
And then this power switch that's down here works the same way, except it has contactors here that if you power, it will throw the switch, and if you coast, it will just stay in the straight position.
Right.
And again, it's exactly the same type of thing. The only difference is the contactor is different.
Right.
And there's quite a bit of weight up there that they've suspended this thing quite well